30 years of investigation as a scientist have convinced me that the evidence is overwhelming that planet Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. In other words, some UFOs are alien vehicles. Furthermore, it is clear now that the government of the United States, some few people within it, have known since at least 1947, when a crashed saucer was recovered complete with 4 alien bodies outside Roswell, New Mexico, that indeed the planet is being visited. The subject is a kind of cosmic Watergate.
In March 1983, I was working on a documentary for Home Box Office entitled UFOs, the ET Factor. During research, I was taken to Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where an Air Force Office of Special Investigations agent showed me several pages entitled Briefing Paper for the President of the United States of America on the subject of unidentified flying vehicles. The paper suggested strongly that our government has known for at least 40 years that extraterrestrials and their craft have been visiting this Earth.
Starting in 1976, Freedom of Information Act requests were filed with the U.S. government. These Freedom of Information Act requests asked for any documents that various intelligence agencies might have relating to UFOs. Over the last 10 years, a number of agencies have responded and have generated several thousand pages of documents. These documents show that intelligence agencies in the United States government have maintained an interest in the UFO subject and tracked it for at least the last 40 years.
Since 1975, I've worked with nearly 200 people who have reported in great detail having been abducted and having been taken aboard UFOs for very bizarre physical examinations. This sort of procedure takes place from childhood on, as if these people are being followed like a tagged animal, something of that sort. I've worked with Army officers who have been abducted, psychiatrists who have been abducted, scientists who have been abducted, police officers, people from every walk of life. This is the core meaning of the entire UFO phenomenon. They are interested in us and they are studying us involuntarily.
Welcome to Summit University Forum, where the flame of freedom speaks. I'm Elizabeth Clare Prophet.
Historically, Americans have been called to be the keepers of the flame of liberty, and that liberty depends on innovative thinkers, the free exchange of ideas, and people with a can-do spirit.
The flame of freedom speaks, the flame of freedom within each heart, the flame of freedom saith unto all.
Elizabeth Clare Prophet, noted author, lecturer, educator, and religious leader, interviews revolutionaries in every field who provide the missing dimension to the news that affects you. Listen as Elizabeth Clare Prophet and her guests discuss the critical issues of the day. This week, you'll hear the second of 5 segments of Elizabeth Clare Prophet's interview with 4 of the nation's leading authorities on UFOs: Stanton Friedman, Linda Howe, Dr. Bruce Maccabee, and Bud Hopkins. Their topic, alien spacecraft and government secrecy. In part 1, they discuss the physical evidence that alien spacecraft have been visiting the Earth. Today, they will discuss the widespread abduction and examination of people by aliens from other planets, and the early stages of the government's cover-up of its knowledge that alien spacecraft are visiting the Earth.
Tell us now what typically happens to someone who is abducted. You've studied thousands of cases.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is I have been dealing with the phenomenon for a long time, and I know that when people come back from an abduction experience, very often what they remember is not exactly what happened. It's as if their memories have been altered, played with, whatnot, through some sort of hypnotic means. We don't know what happens. And we know that they have been told certain things sometimes, which is obviously not true, and there's a certain degree of deception in these abduction experiences.
On the part of the UFOs.
On the part of the UFO occupants. Now, that's a difficult thing to handle for me. And these gentlemen are handling the fact that you start with a deceptive UFO phenomenon, which is now being handled by a deceptive government. So they have doubled the problem as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I would prefer the smaller can of worms, which is what I try to handle, and leave them to this extremely labyrinthian search for truth within government deception about what is in fact alien deception. Typical problem, difficult problem. I once...
Government deception about non-alien deception is bad enough.
I once gave a talk before a small informal group of the United Nations, and informal, and I was making the obvious point about deception from the UFO occupants. And leading up to that, I said, and here were people of every nationality, race, location, and so forth in the audience. I said, first of all, there's deception up there, and of course we know that governments lie, and which I thought was just a truism, and the whole audience broke into hysterical laughter. It's as if that's the one thing they're trained not to say at the United Nations. And it was very nice for them to hear somebody say the government something they know all day long in their work. At any rate, there is deception in the UFO phenomenon from the beginning. Now I'd like to just outline how I came to write about it and so forth. I was doing investigations. I'm an artist, and this is something I do on the side, so to speak. But I made a discovery. I made a couple of discoveries that made me feel that I had to write a book about this. The first discovery I made was that with the Betty and Barty Hill case and very few related cases that we knew about, the Hickson case, the Travis Walton case, and so forth, there were not many cases in by 1975 when I got involved in this. There was a basic belief about these abductions, and that was that the person remembered sort of large chunks of it. They at least were aware that they had missed a period of time that was gone out of some kind of a trip, or that there were half memories or nightmares or something, the Betty and Barney Hill story. But I ran into a case where a man said to me, "But I think something happened to me on such and such a road." I said, and he said, "I think it involved UFOs." I said, "Did you see anything?" Doesn't remember seeing anything. I said, "Did you notice there was a time problem? You looked at your watch?" No. And I said, "Well, what makes you think that?" He said, "I just had this feeling." And he said, "Every time I hit a certain stretch of highway," this is a trip I frequently make coming back and forth with my girlfriends, "I start to get panicked because I knew somehow that something happened to me on that stretch of highway." But there was literally nothing else that he could recall. We began to explore it. We used hypnosis, and out tumbled an abduction case, which was very much like the Betty and Barney Hill case, quite terrifying. And for the first time, we looked at one another and thought, this could have happened to anybody. It could have happened to anybody listening to us at this very moment, without their having much memory beyond such a very feeble clue as a terror of a certain place, which came on them at a certain point, and it was associated with the idea that something happened there. The second thing I discovered was that certain people seemed to have been abducted in childhood and then re-abducted later. Now, we had always assumed in these cases that if somebody reported this kind of experience and then reported it again, even heavy-duty sightings, that we would sort of discount them because this didn't happen over and over again to the same person. But I've discovered in two of our cases that it seemed to have happened as if that person was, let's say, being tagged and followed, as I mentioned earlier, like a tagged animal. And the third thing I discovered was that two of the people I was working with, ultimately three, reported scars that appeared sort of magically on their bodies as children when they had a missing time experience. The scar was up the back of the leg or whatever. I'll go into this in a second, but essentially the fact remained that they had no recollection of how these scars got there. They felt very funny, very queasy about the scars. They were remembered by the family as very unusual. And under hypnosis, they recalled the instrument that made the cut when they were on a table inside a craft in this experience. Well, those were three, in essence, new pieces of information. I mean, other investigators may have run into them too. I'm not making that claim, but the point is that I thought it needed to be said. Ultimately, I said I wouldn't do anything more on the subject in terms of writing anything until and if there was some new information. What I began to discover flowing right out of that was that, granted, people were picked up as children, they were picked up again and again, they were tracked many, many times, in some cases many, many times. There's a situation that I'm working with now where there may be an abduction every couple of weeks with a particular individual. And what I began to discover is that that person, as an adult and becoming married and producing a family, had a very strong risk that the child that was produced by that marriage was also going to be abducted, as if a certain bloodline is being followed. And the family I was working with in a core way in this book had, across 3 generations, abduction experiences, even branches, the Kathy Davis case, and even branches of the family. I also found, and this, I will just go into this very quickly, and it is the most bizarre part of the whole thing. We had known from the early cases that there were apparently samples being taken of sperm from the males and ova from the females. And there seemed to be a very strong interest in the genetic side of this, which would of course explain why families are being tracked across generations. What we discovered is that in a number of cases, women had, I only had 5 at the time I started the book, women apparently had been abducted, had been artificially inseminated in a very sterile laboratory situation, had found themselves pregnant, were not consciously remembering the experience except that something odd happened around a certain time. They are then re-abducted, and in a number of these cases, through going to gynecologists and so on, it was established they were definitely pregnant. All of a sudden, magically, they were no longer pregnant after another odd experience, which under hypnosis and through conscious recollection in a number of cases, they remember being re-abducted and this developing fetus is removed. And in this part of the story, even some of the males are involved, human beings. The people are ultimately, and this is the wildest part of it, re-abducted and are shown a tiny hybrid child, asked to hold the child. The UFO occupants are avidly watching to see the response of that adult human to the child, as if they're trying to learn by osmosis or Lord knows how what our human maternal and paternal impulses, feelings are, as if they're trying to learn not only how the reproductive system works, but how we respond psychologically and caringly about a child, as if they're just as hungry for that as they are for the genetic material. Now, I have, since the book has come out, and I kept certain details secret because I did not want book intruders. I did not want the people just to read the book and come back to me with the stories that they had picked up. I kept certain details that I had encountered in these cases over and over again, kept them secret so that I would have a way of checking the veracity of new people. And I can tell you that over and over again, people I've dealt with since then have filled in those details, and they're very bizarre and very specific details. Now, the basic pattern of this, and this is totally, this whole thing sounds very bizarre, I have to admit. It doesn't sound like anything any of us want to be true, including the people to whom it happens. Now, to go back to the basic pattern, a child is often abducted even from the crib as a tiny little child. I've worked now with a case which seems, because of the reaction of the child, it's a long story which I won't go into, it seems something happened to a child when the child was 9 or 10 months old. The child is often re-abducted, or maybe for the first time, as a little toddler or a 4 or 5 year old. One of the cases involves a child who was on her little tricycle in her yard in Florida. Her mother was inside cooking and looking out the window and watching the little child pedaling back and forth. And at one moment the child has disappeared, is gone. Broad daylight. Well, of course, total panic set in. The mother rushes outside. The child is nowhere in sight and the tricycle's gone. The mother called, her husband called the police. A search was set up. A man 7 miles away working in an orange grove suddenly looked around and there was a little girl on a tricycle sitting in his orange grove, 7 miles away, 2 hours later. The little child was not crying as if she'd been lost for 2 hours, where's mommy, or something of that sort. The child just, what's she doing here? The man took the little child to the house, called the police, and the child was reinstated with the parents. Excuse me. Now, the mother later that night, the child had no recollection where she'd been. The mother later that night, when she undressed the child, found up the back of the leg of the child a very deep cut, a surgical-like incision, which was bloodless, painless. The child had no idea how it got there. There was no tear in the pants. We have many, many cases of what seems to be then a sampling of cells, very often on the leg, and very often there's never any tear in the clothing or something, and the child does not remember how. had happened. That's the second thing that happened. And very often, another time in childhood, the child will remember, sometimes consciously and sometimes through the aid of hypnosis, that a needle with a little tiny 2-millimeter ball on the end with little projections, a needle is inserted up the nostril, again when the child is on a table in a UFO, unable to move. There's a breaking through up in the top of the nasal cavity, and when the needle comes back out, often there's pain connected with this. There's no little ball on the end. And in some cases, people have described the needle going in with nothing on it, and when it comes out, the ball is on there, which hadn't been in place before, as if these are put in and taken out. In some cases, they describe the needle going in through the ear, and in some cases through the eye socket, below the eye socket. We believe that these are some kind of monitoring device, possibly, or some way of locating the person, like a tagged animal. We do not know what these things are made of. We have not yet found one. Certainly they're not radio opaque, so we're not getting them on X-rays. I'm convinced that one day we will have one of these things. But the next thing that happens is that the person, through puberty, is picked up, and the ova and sperm sample are taken. And with females, this happens many times. There is often a gynecological examination involved. These experiences, which I will not go into, are very, very traumatic. The entire experience is traumatic. Just a quick example, a man who I worked with, who was an Army officer, and 6'2", very macho young man at the time, an Irishman. He didn't like people messing with him. He recalled being on this table. The little figures were this tall around him. He couldn't move. Various examinations of the sort I've been describing took place. And he was deciding in his mind that when he could become mobile, he was going to make a break for it. Now, I don't know where he thought he was going to go. He might have found himself 32,000 miles up somewhere. But we don't know where he was, except inside some kind of craft. He said, "Bud, they turned me, or they lifted me up and turned me, and my feet went down to the floor." And he said, "I just stood there. And it wasn't that I couldn't move, I just had no will, no ability, no desire to move. I just stood there like this." And this little man, about this big, came over with these long, thin, gray fingers, took him by the wrist. He said, he just turned me like this, and I just went with him. And he said, "You know, Bud, I was the giant in that room, but I was the baby." This was not an easy thing for this man to admit. The helplessness, the sense of being not told anything. Nobody understands why. It is a severe kind of traumatic experience to undergo. And as I say, I've worked with people in every single walk of life. A couple of people who are nationally known in the entertainment field, a microbiologist. You can go through every kind of area. I have had 2 psychiatrists, 3 psychologists, and 4 psychotherapists come to me to have me, through hypnosis, explore their abduction experiences.
Many of these sound like the Whitley Strieber account.
Well, Whitley was one of the people I worked with, and it's a very confusing account for people who've read his book. He wrote the book extremely hurriedly. He found out that he was an abductee. We began looking into it, and he had written and sold a book on it within less than 6 months. And it's filled with real things that really happen, a lot of confusion and disorder, because it takes a long time to sort these things out, and a lot of speculation. So it's, even though he is genuinely an abductee, the book in many respects is not the book I would recommend to someone interested in the subject.
The book I would recommend is your book, which is why I've invited you to be on the forum today.
Thank you.
And I just want to say that the amount of data and the meticulousness with which you present it, and the repetitiveness of these experiences of so many people from so many walks of life all being the same, allows us to draw conclusions. And I suggest that anyone who is truly interested in trying to understand what is happening and why it's being done, and thereby going back to the mentality of these androids and those who have sent them, who are the masterminds of their scouting expeditions, should read your book. It couldn't be more thorough, and with that data, we proceed. Do you want to tie into this?
Well, there's a very provocative parallel to all of this, and it even includes similar geography. Bud finds that not only is it an isolated individual, but it can be families and generations. in the mutilation mystery phenomenon. There is one rancher east of Colorado Springs in Colorado who had on the same hill, year after year after year, for 5 springs, same month, same hill, mutilation. The geographic consistency, why is there a repetitive pattern in same geographies? That's one example, there are many. Why is it that one particular ranch in New Mexico has had 11 mutilations on the same ranch in the same pasture since 1978? The parallel with the bloodless cuts. In mutilations, we're talking about cookie cutter cuts. You're talking about an instance where sheriffs have had as many as 3 mutilation reports in one day, same county. They get to an animal that is warm to touch. That means it's dead only a few hours. A cookie cutter cut, the scrotum, the penis are removed in an oval, and there is no blood, and it's only as deep as the hide. Not even the lumen underneath the hide that is between the muscle tissue and the hide is removed. It's absolutely, cookie cutter was the word that was coined by a sheriff in Montana, because he said that's what we're dealing with, cookie cutter cuts. Bud is talking about people who have stood and felt like they had no will of their own, have been powerless to move. In 1978, east of Colorado Springs, where between 1975 and 1979, there were approximately an estimate of 550 mutilation reports in sheriff's files in the state of Colorado in that period. So you're talking about a lot of law enforcement reports. So you had these repetitive patterns, repetitive pastures, and sheriffs and ranchers were beginning to form, the ranchers especially, little vigilante groups of their own. In this one particular case, 6 ranchers with guns went out in a pickup truck to a pasture where there had been repetitive mutilations. And on this particular night, they are there and they have their guns when they see what they say later looked like a helicopter. The helicopter is coming toward them and they're standing there watching it. Stops in the air, descends to the pasture, and these men do not move. And what they said later, the hair went up on the back of their necks and they felt they could not move. Now, they didn't say they were paralyzed. And it could be stark terror, but that's not their description. It is simply they feel the hair go up on the back of their necks and they feel like they can't move or don't want to move. Later, whatever this is, rises back up in the air and went right back exactly the direction from which it came. Now, the next thing you would expect is that those men would move out into the pasture. And they didn't. They went and got back in the truck, and they all went back home. They did not go back out into the pasture until after sunrise the next morning, and they went out with the sheriff. And in the exact same pasture where they had been standing with their guns are 2 mutilated cows 30 feet from each other. What all of that adds up to is something that is so bizarre and so strange that when you tell these kinds of stories, they sound like science fiction. And with that as a context of dozens and dozens of stories like that, people who feel like they've been paralyzed in the presence of something that they think is a helicopter. Why? When you ask, it's because the focus of the light comes down like this and they say it looks like a police helicopter. But when you ask, did you see the red lights or white lights or green lights or anything else? No, it was the triangular beam. So that's their definition of the helicopter, a triangular beam of light. And with that as a context to separate this from the constant, you will hear people say, it's predator, it's cult, it's media hysteria. I'm saying to those people who say that, they have not studied at all what animal mutilations are about, and the parallel with taking the same kinds of areas, sexual organs, and then other eye, ear, and tongue. There's this parallel in the human abduction, but the animals are killed, the humans are not. The humans are traumatized, but some of the same areas seem to be under observation.
I would like to comment on what you've said so far, and that is that what we learn from this, when we can separate ourselves from our desire not to know, and not to know what our subconscious does know about this, is obviously and clinically speaking, empirically speaking, we are getting data as to the powers of these people, their technology, what they are capable of doing to our minds, to our bodies, to our will, to our movement, and of course surgically very much advanced beyond us.
One thing that Linda said, that when she said people glibly make these assertions that it's media hysteria or coyotes or something, and they don't know the material, they have not looked into it. I was on a television program recently with Carl Sagan, and although we were on different subjects, and he said, but we had a long conversation, it's a long story, but the basic point was, he said that we should have better evidence. And then he said, after all, he said, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary proof. And I said, well, there's no doubt that this phenomenon exists as a phenomenon. We have these mutilated animals, whatever, but we certainly have all these UFO photographs, radar reports, anecdotal accounts, ground traces, the things that Stan was talking about, and so on. I said that all exists for sure. And I said it seems to me that what we should say instead is that an extraordinary phenomenon demands an extraordinary investigation. And but the basic point is the evidence is there, and it is no longer possible, it seems to me, for science, so many scientists, to turn their backs on it.
As a follow-up, just the glibness of the skeptic, there are people who will say, well, people under hypnosis will make up any kind of story
Exactly.
to please the hypnotist. As Bud will certify, and has in the past certainly, a number of people, dozens of people that he has worked with, remember the total experience and don't require any hypnosis to bring it out. Secondly, the reverse. You have, what, a couple of dozen people who have gone under hypnosis with the possibility that maybe there was an abduction involved, who have not had an abduction experience. So the fact that there are these two groups, people who remember without hypnosis and people who don't produce an abduction under hypnosis, is clear proof that it is not a result, that the abduction story is not a result of the peculiar circumstances of hypnotic regression, let's say, or trying to please the hypnotist. And as in most cases, the people aren't pleased at all themselves, I should add.
Well,
so there are glib explanations from people who don't examine the evidence. That's the bane of our existence.
Well, I think that we need to move forward as a part of the people of this planet who are willing to face reality, the actualities of our time, and look at it, and not be concerned about the non-believers and those who have too much fear to face it, because one day, this evidence being so overwhelming, they will have to look at it. So, Bruce, I'd like to talk to you about General Nathan Twining, who eventually became the Air Force Chief of Staff and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And he wrote a memo on flying discs in 1947 that demonstrated his belief in UFOs. I'd like you to comment on that and show you the slides you have on that topic.
You've heard now really an overview of the situation almost from A to Z. We haven't really talked about specific UFO sightings in any particular detail, but we have covered the idea of government cover-up going back a long time, and going up to the newest stuff that's been discovered about perhaps the alien intentions. We were just talking a few minutes ago about the evidence and the importance of evidence, and that we should have an extraordinary investigation to find out whether there is evidence. I'm reminded of a statement a lawyer made to me, however, which was that in a legal case, hard evidence, proof, if you will, often is not very important. The hard evidence can often be refuted. All you have to do is get the experts to start wrangling over points, and it all falls apart. What proves a case in court is the circumstantial evidence. Can you provide a history of who, what, where, why, when, how, etc., that all sticks together? And if you can do that, then you're very likely to get a positive decision in a court of law based on your circumstantial evidence case, regardless of whether there was hard evidence. And so what I want to do is really sort of drop back in history now and show you how this whole thing, this whole government cover-up aspect may have begun way back 41 years ago, starting in July of 1947. And there have been arguments for years over whether or not the failure of the U.S. government to come to grips with this problem was a result of a foul-up or a cover-up. Were the Project Blue Book investigators actually sufficiently naive to believe that they had explained all the cases, and the few cases they hadn't explained were irrelevant? Or was it a situation that was, well, as I mentioned before, they're sort of their job. In the viewpoint of the CIA, they were doing a good job if they simply divided the unexplained from the explained and left it at that. You would expect that if there were a scientific investigation, you'd take the unexplained cases and try to find out why are they unexplained? What do you learn from studying unexplained cases? Well, we know now, as a result of information that came out over the last 20 years, this document is almost 20 years old now, but primarily over the last 10 years, that the government was not, the intelligence agencies in the government, and particularly the Air Force, they were not so stupid after all. Here is a document here written by General Nathan Twining, who was the head of the Air Materiel Command at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base at the time. It was called Wright Field. And he is responding in this letter to a request from another general. This other general had asked for an opinion on these reports of flying saucers that the Air Force intelligence had collected. It says, it is the opinion that the phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious, and goes on to describe characteristics of the objects. And by the time he gets to the end of this letter, which is a secret letter from him to another general, he says we ought to set up an investigation. He lists a bunch of agencies that should be contacted, that should be in on it. And he also pointed out in this secret level letter that there was no hardware to prove it, but on the other hand, there was an awful lot of, let's say, software or circumstantial evidence that there was something going on. We will tackle the hardware, his statement about hardware later on, but just for the point, the main point is that here he starts off his letter by saying the phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious. And then, at the end of the letter, he essentially directs this other general to set up an intelligence collection effort, which is really a formal document that goes out to the various branches of the air, in that case it was the Army Intelligence Agency, to collect all the information they could about these flying saucers. So clearly they were taking it seriously right from the beginning. What this suggests is the top levels of the intelligence organization in the Air Force knew something about UFOs, flying saucers, that they weren't telling the other people. On the other hand, the public statements of the Air Force at the time generally poo-pooed the subject. There were all sorts of, this is back in the summer of 1947 when it all began, and there were all sorts of explanations flying around, and misidentifications and hoaxes were some of the most important identifications. Misidentification meaning that a person sees something that he can't identify, he makes a report to a group of supposed experts who analyze the information in the report and say, oh, you thought that was a flying saucer, in fact it was a Goodyear blimp, or oh, you thought it was a flying saucer, in fact it was Superman going by. Some mundane explanation like that. Well, the intelligence agencies, as I said, poo-pooed the subject and the witnesses. Publicly. And that put a general damper on everything from the civilian point of view. Scientists were not immune to this initial cover-up. I'm jumping up now to a document written by a scientist in November 1951, Project Twinkle final report, written by a man, Louis Elterman, who was at the Air Force Geophysics Laboratory in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Project Twinkle had been set up to collect information, photographic evidence if possible, on a series of unusual sightings of what were called green fireballs over the Southwest in 1948, 1949, and 1950. They had companies down there working at White Sands, the missile test areas where they launched some of the early missiles, including the German missiles that they had captured and some of our early designs for missiles. These scientists who were tracking the missiles were asked to use their equipment if by any chance some unusual object, circular, 10 feet in diameter, dome disk, etc., some unusual object should happen to fly by, oh, by the way, there is one, please take a Ascania phototheodolite, which is a device that gives you the altitude, that gives you the elevation and azimuth, and photograph it for us. Well, now this report is 1951. By the time this report was written, all the studies had been, quote, completed, unquote, and this was the final report. And the first page of that final report, at the top sentence says, referring to a particular time period between April 1950 and September 1950, it says, some photographic activity occurred on the 27th of April and the 24th of May 1950, but simultaneous sightings by both cameras were not made, so that no information was gained. Simultaneous sightings by both cameras were not made, so we didn't learn anything. Immediately that should put a little bit of a question mark. You know, what did they sight simultaneously on both cameras that he's sweeping under the rug here? Fortunately, because of a diligent investigator who looked through the Air Force file on the microfilm record, I can tell you what it was. In this paragraph, he goes on to refer to other events. In August 1950, several events where many dozens of these technicians who were working at White Sands saw groups of objects flying over, but didn't succeed in getting any film. Well, what was he referring to? What was he referring to with this simultaneous sightings were on different objects, and so no information was gained? There was found in the Project Blue Book file a unassuming document, 2 pages long, which referred to the 27th of April and the 24th of May 1950, when, lo and behold, objects appeared on both of these dates, flying. I don't know if anybody's been down around the Alamogordo, White Sands area, but it's a big valley between 2 mountain chains. Objects appeared over one of these mountain chains, and some observers spotted them and immediately contacted the phototheodolite men. Now these guys all had earphones on. They had just carried out rocket tests. Okay, so they still had film. Some of them still had film in their cameras. They still had their earphones on. Hey, there's one. Quick, get on that microphone. And suddenly a bunch of people are looking up in the sky. And it says that on 2 days this happened. On one of the days they got phototheodolite film. But upon analysis it was determined that what they filmed were 2 different objects. Now, Elterman was saying that we didn't gain any information. The information they wanted to know was how far away are the objects, and therefore we could figure out how big they were. In fact, these 2 theodolites, one was pointing at an object here and one was pointing at an object there. They were real objects that the people didn't identify, but because it wasn't the same object, no information was gained, and therefore Elterman in his official report could say, no information was gained, go on to the next thing, sweep it under the rug. What he didn't say was that on one of these particular days, following a specific rocket test on the 27th of April, they had sufficient photographic information to make a triangulation on an object. And here's the report by a mathematician of the mathematical reduction unit there. They immediately took the film in, they developed it, they calibrated their theodolites, and the net result was that these objects were flying at an altitude of 150,000 feet, were 30 feet in diameter, were flying at a high but undetermined speed, and were over the Tularosa mountain chain, which would put them east of Alamogordo Air Force Base. This information is not even referred to in Elterman's report, which was the final report from Project Twinkle. That was circulated to a number of Air Force and intelligence agencies. Here's the result of our 3 years' worth of effort to collect information. And basically he said, well, we had a lot of sightings of things, but later on in the report he says probably they could all have been identified as birds or balloons or things just flying by. This document is in the Project Blue Book record, was not referred to at all by Elterman. Is that a cover-up or a foul-up? He was the project director. He was the guy that all the information flowed to. You make up your own mind. Here I just talked about Louis Elterman, who was a scientist. The Air Force intelligence people who collected reports were of the same bent, shall we say, to sweep things under the rug. In 1949, a group of 5 people who were fishing on the Rogue River in Oregon saw an object. I will show you a drawing of it. 2 of those gentlemen were employees of the Ames Research Laboratory, where they were doing some of the early experiments on jet engines. They were working at a classified defense installation. Within a week after they had had this sighting, in the company of 3 other people, 2 men, actually there are 3 men and 2 women involved, 2 of the men worked at Ames. They made a report directly to their security agency, the security office, and this right here is a little thing saying the security office is requesting an investigation by the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Basically, the security office is saying, these 2 guys came in, they told us this weird story, we think you should look into it. So here's an official request to do an investigation. The AFOSI people sic their local intelligence agencies on these 2 men, interviewed them not once, but twice independently, second time asking them to sign affidavits. These long verbal descriptions of what they saw I won't bother to read, but each person said that he had over a minute to look at this thing through binoculars, and it was generally described as being, when seen by the naked eye, it looked like a shiny thing, like a coin seen on edge, and when you looked at it through binoculars it became a pancake-shaped thing with a fin on the top, and one guy said that the edge of it looked wrinkled or dirty. Now, if you can see an object well enough to think that the surface looks wrinkled or dirty, you can certainly see the overall shape. In other words, the shape description that they were giving is highly credible. One man was a draftsman working at Ames, the other guy was a wind tunnel mechanic. And of course there were the other 3 other people who had also seen it. Well, the intelligence officer carried out a long investigation, interviewed everybody, collected all the information. He also attempted to come up with an explanation in terms of well, what could have been in the air over Rogue River at the time? And he found that radar kites were launched in San Francisco, which is some 300 miles southeast of the mouth of the Rogue River. So he put into his report, perhaps these were radar kites. Here on the right-hand side, it shows at the top, it shows balloons, which down below the balloons, 4 balloons holding it up, is a folded piece of aluminum foil. This is a radar kite. And if you go to the Project Blue Book records and you look up the date of this sighting, you look in this catalog at the beginning of the microfilm record. The catalog tells you what dates the sightings were, a little bit of information, and the identification. And it's identified as kites. Okay? This is the real cover of Special Report 14, as opposed to a published commercial version. In Project Blue Book Special Report 14, which Stan referred to earlier, we found a sketch based on the verbal descriptions, the very detailed verbal descriptions. And you can compare this shape of a round pancake-shaped object with a tail on it, some sort of louvers or something around the edge. This object was described as coming into their view, hovering, rotating on a vertical axis, not banking or anything like a plane, rotating on an axis, then speeding up and taking off, accelerating to the speed of a jet plane within a minute or so. Now, am I to believe that this is a radar kite?
A fast one.
This is one of the faster radar kites in the world. There were a number of scientists in the early days who made sightings which were effectively swept under the rug. One famous debunking scientist from the Naval Research Laboratory said that all credible UFO sightings, and by this he meant sightings where the person who described what he saw, he was a credible person, he probably gave an accurate description. All credible UFO sightings were actually sightings of skyhook balloons. In 1947, the Navy, it may seem strange that it was the Navy, but the Navy started launching high-altitude research balloons, balloons which would expand to a diameter of 100 feet and reach an altitude of 100,000 feet. Ostensibly, this was for high-altitude research. The intelligence agencies that were involved really wanted to be able to send some of these balloons with cameras all the way around the world and then retrieve the cameras. Be that as it may, in the early 50s, it was by this time known that these experiments were going on. And Dr. Erner Liddell said all UFO sightings which are credible are sightings that people make sightings of these high-altitude balloons up in the sky At sunrise or sunset, when they're illuminated by the sun, they're very brilliant. What he didn't say or didn't know was that many of the early sightings were made by the gentleman who actually launched these balloons at the same time that the balloons were in the air. Here's a listing of them. I'll very briefly discuss a few. In 1951, a balloon had been launched near Artesia, New Mexico. Some gentlemen were standing in the airport watching the balloon way up overhead. Gee, look at that balloon up there. Oh, what are these two things coming along? They go and make a circle around the balloon, flipping up on edge as they do it. Just a couple more flying saucers, that's all. But these were the guys who launched the balloon. Surely they could determine what was the balloon and what wasn't the balloon. Later on in 1951, two gentlemen flying along in an airplane were tracking a balloon, which their group had launched. This was near Minneapolis, Minnesota. And they are flying south, and to their east something comes along and does this very strange sort of a maneuver, flying along, reversing its direction, going through a loop, and then shooting straight up. And it was described in shape as being your standard Model A disc type of thing, not the balloon. The next day, the same gentleman, also a bunch of people on the ground, had another sighting, again a bizarre situation in terms of the aerodynamics or the dynamics of motion, where an object came from their left, slowed down and went into a reverse spiral upwards. Instead of like floating down like a leaf might do, it floated up in a spiral shape and then went back off into the direction it had come. Now here is another later sighting by a meteorologist who watched a thing through his theodolite instead of flying in a straight path. Well, one object flew in a straight path, another object oscillated above and below that straight path. Yet another theodolite sighting where a man saw this object come along, go through a loop, and then disappeared. Now, those were people, as I said, who were scientists working on projects where their job was to look in the sky and be able to distinguish things like birds and whatever that would distract them from what they were trying to track, the balloon. One group of scientists that was involved, one of the earliest sightings involving these balloon launching gentlemen, was in 1949, April 24th, 1949, and it was declared as one of the best UFO sightings, most detailed, most credible observers, etc. Multiple witness sighting, these gentlemen viewed the thing through a telescope. The best sighting up until 1952. It was so declared by none other than the late Dr. Donald H. Menzel, who was the head of the Harvard Observatory at the time, a well-known astrophysicist, literally known throughout the world for his work on astrophysics. He had been involved in eclipse expedition to Russia. Not so well known was that he had been in intelligence during the Second World War. And I might point out my mention of Menzel will lead subsequently to MJ-12. But this is an interesting study by itself. Menzel had said nothing about UFOs up until the summer of 1952, when there was a big flap in the United States, especially around the Washington, D.C. area. There were a lot of sightings. Menzel was quoted as saying that it was all a result of atmospheric refractions, distant lights on the horizon being bent by the atmosphere and appearing in oddball directions and so on. In 1953, he published a book that tried to back up his claim. In the book, he referred to these sightings of 24 April 1949 involving 4 men in the desert in New Mexico near White Sands who were tracking a balloon. It was actually a man by the name of Moore, Charles B. Moore, who was still alive and lives in Roswell, New Mexico, and 4 Navy enlisted men. Moore was teaching the Navy enlisted men how to track a balloon. And one of the Navy men was watching the balloon, and the Navy man was watching through the telescope. Moore was looking with his naked eyes. He looked up, he saw a white object up there, and he could look and see that the telescope was pointing in another direction. After cursing for a few seconds, because these balloons are expensive, he grabbed the theodolite, thinking that the Navy man had lost the balloon and the theodolite was tracking the wrong thing. He switched over to this other object and realized it was moving very fast. He switched the theodolite back, there was the balloon. Better track this other thing. He switched back to the thing that was moving, and he tracked it through a large arc in motion, and subsequently published a story saying it was a very high altitude and traveling very fast. Well, this story was reported in Life magazine along with a bunch of other sightings in spring of 1952, and Menzel tackled this particular case. Now, it is important to note that Menzel had clearances that would give him access to any Air Force records virtually that he wanted, including the records of the project, which was called Grudge at the time, that was collecting reports such as this. Menzel said in one of his books that he had in fact been called in by the Air Force to offer explanations for cases. The implication is that Menzel had access to the actual information on this sighting. But what did he put in his book? He put in his book a highly watered down version, and it's sort of, well, first of all, his book was an attempt to be portrayed as very scientific. Here is an experiment that he carried out, and he photographed the experiment to show how the atmosphere can refract things. It's actually a little experiment in a jar, but the fundamental physics is the same. He argues that atmospheric refractions cause all these problems. And now, if you could center on this drawing, what this drawing is in the book, and this is Menzel's portrayal of what happened, that there's a man down here on the ground looking up at a balloon at a very high altitude, and because of a weird atmospheric effect that Menzel assumes occurred, he can't prove it, a refraction occurs and a mirage of the balloon suddenly drops downwards, hovers for a short period of time, and then shoots back up.
That's a neat trick.
This is Menzel's argument about the data in the sighting. In other words, he's in fact saying the data amount to the guy looking through the theodolite. He sees this object apparently drop downwards and then shot back up after a few seconds of hovering. And then he made this argument about the mirage effect doing that. He had a hypothesis which I can read to you for those of you who might be technically interested. A weather balloon breaking through the top of the inversion layer, where there might be a high temperature above a low temperature in the atmosphere, will carry with it a bubble of hot air. The overlying layer will sag into the hotter level and momentarily act like a big lens in the atmosphere. It's all very technical stuff, focusing whatever happens to be above it. Thus, it may produce a distorted image of the balloon. This is all a hypothesis that Menzel generates just for this one case. He backed it up, if you could show the top of this page, an appendix in the book, Theory of Mirages. 20 or 30 pages on how mirages occur and how his hypothesized very special type of mirage might have occurred. And he summarizes by saying, this incident, kept in classified files for more than 2 years, presents no serious difficulty to the person who understands the unusual aspects of the Earth's atmosphere. The air can, under special conditions, produce formations similar to lenses. This is a statement he's making based on a long series of very tenuous assumptions. And just as a burning glass can project the sun. What more that man who was the witness saw was an out of focus and badly astigmatic image of the balloon above. Okay, that's his claim in the book. Now here's the guy who's the head of the Harvard Observatory, the first scientist to write a book on the UFO subject. When libraries decided to buy books on the subject, who did they turn to? Some of the hack writers in the field? No, I mean a man with authority, Donald Menzel. And so the readers of Menzel's book thought, well, Menzel obviously has explained this sighting by Charles Moore and 4 enlisted men, and this was, he said, the best sighting around. If you can explain the best, why even worry about the next best? Well, once the Project Blue Book files were released, which was 20 years after Menzel's book was released, anybody could go there and find out the object report, the actual report by Charles Moore and his gentlemen of what really happened that day. And you could ask yourself, does it square with what Menzel said? Here is this long description of all the events that occurred, and his signature down at the bottom. He was the head of the General Mills Aeronautical Research Division at the time, a man with authority. You have to know what he's talking about. And if you use that report to plot the data, as it were, his sighting directions, his azimuths as he gave in this report, you find that this object didn't just start from a point up here, drop downwards, and go up. It made a great big arc around them like that. In fact, if you were to plot on graph paper the actual sighting directions, it started from one initial sighting in the southwest and ended up in the northeast. And one thing that apparently attracted Moore to this sighting was that he says that this thing was going off into the distance. it started, before it disappeared, it started to rise upwards, as if it were leaving the Earth's atmosphere. Well, Menzel in his book, in his appendix, had created a theory which said that if this mirage theory was right, the image of the object is up here, could drop downwards by a certain amount, and that amount could be 1/4 of a degree. That's a teeny weeny amount, about half the angular size of the moon. And as I said, he had backed up his theory with this big long, he has backed up his claim with this big long theoretical dissertation, which nevertheless was based on a bunch of tenuous arguments. But to the outside observer, not an expert in atmospheric physics, this could seem very convincing, especially coming with the authority of Dr. Menzel. If you look at the original data, the sighting angle from the initial position to the final position is from here to here. That's 120 degrees, only 400 times larger than the largest angle that Menzel's theory would allow. What that means is, if Dr. Menzel had put the actual report into his book, written down, just copied Moore's report and then said, now I'll explain it, any intelligent person could have seen that Menzel's theory didn't hold water. To reverse the argument, in a sense, the only way to make his theory stick was to distort the data so much that there was virtually nothing to the sighting after he got finished with it. Now, was this intentional or was this an accident? Menzel was known as being a very thorough scientist. He'd written lots of books on theory and experiment and so on. Could it be that in the UFO business he just had such a blind spot that he was willing to write almost anything, providing he did it carefully, to explain sightings? Or was this an intentioned effort on his part to get rid of this sighting, because being the best, he had to get rid of the best first, and then he could go on and take the rest on? Keep that in mind when we talk a little bit later about Kirtland.
You have been watching the second of 5 segments of Elizabeth Clare Prophet's interview with Stanton Friedman, Linda Howe, Dr. Bruce Maccabee, and Bud Hopkins on alien spacecraft and government secrecy. Don't miss part 3, when Mrs. Prophet and her guests will discuss the recovery of a saucer with 4 alien bodies that crashed near Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. Check your station or local listings for the times. The preceding public access program has been presented through the assistance of Summit University, Box A, Livingston, Montana, 59047 1390. If you would like to know more, call this number or write this address. For information on the full-length version of this and other Summit University forums, as well as lectures on the defense of freedom by Elizabeth Clare Prophet, call toll-free 1-800-323-5228 or write Summit University Press, Box A, Livingston, Montana, 59047-1390.